He has had 6 tutors in as many months. The Duke of Blackwood's voice was a low rumble of thunder trapped within the cavernous library. Every single one of them fled, one left in the middle of the night claiming the boys were possessed. Mr. Hobbs, the estate steward, stood with his hat clutched in both hands, a study in respectful misery. He did not flinch. He had served the Beaumont family since before Duke Alastair was born, and had seen far worse than a frustrated nobleman. "They are not possessed, your grace. They are grieving." Alastair paced before the cold, cavernous fireplace. The logs were laid perfect and untouched, a monument to the absence of warmth in the house. "They are demons. They put a snake in Mr. Abernathy's bed. They replaced Mr. Finch's writing ink with treacle. They are uncontrollable." He stopped, his broad shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. The anger was a thin veneer over a chasm of exhaustion. Annalise would have known what to do. The mention of his late wife hung in the air, thick and suffocating as dust motes in a sunbeam. It had been 2 years since she had succumbed to a fever, and in that time, Blackwood Manor had transformed from a home into a mausoleum. Alastair had entombed himself in work, in ledgers, in the vast, lonely business of being a duke. He had outsourced his sons, and the arrangement was failing spectacularly. "Perhaps the approach has been wrong, your grace," Hobbs suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "We have provided them with scholars, stern men with rods and Latin grammars. Perhaps they do not need another scholar. Not yet." Alastair turned, a brow arched in weary cynicism. "And what, pray tell, do they need? A lion tamer? An exorcist?" "They need patience," Hobbs said simply. "There is a woman in Oakhaven, a widow. Her name is Elara Vance. She keeps to herself, but the village children adore her. They follow her like ducklings. She has a stillness about her, a quiet." The Duke scoffed. "A quiet village widow to tame my hellions? Hobbs, have you been sampling the sacramental wine again?" The jest was sharp, but held no humor. "She is educated, your grace. Her late husband was a botanist. She reads. But more than that, she listens. She never raises her voice. I have seen her calm the most frightful tantrum from the blacksmith's boy with nothing more than a low word and a steady gaze." Desperation was a bitter taste in Alastair's mouth. He looked out the tall, mullioned window at the manicured grounds, a perfect, soulless expanse of green. He was failing. His sons, his legacy, were running wild, and he was barricaded behind the walls of his own grief. He was a prize bull, bred for strength and title, and he had no idea how to be a father. "Very well," he said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "Send for her. But when she flees screaming within the week, Hobbs, the search for the next one is entirely your affair." Hobbs bowed, a flicker of something like hope in his old eyes. "As you wish, your grace." Elara Vance received the summons with the same quiet composure with which she did everything. She read the note, delivered by a stiff footman who looked thoroughly unnerved to be standing on her humble stone threshold, and a small, thoughtful frown touched her lips. She was a woman who seemed to blend into the soft greens and greys of the countryside. Her dress was simple, patched but immaculately clean. Her dark hair was coiled in a neat bun, and her hands, though often dirt-stained from her garden, were elegant. She was not a duchess. She was not a lady of society. She was a survivor. Her own gilded cage had shattered years ago, leaving her with nothing but a profound understanding of loss and the steely resilience it forged. The footman cleared his throat. "His Grace expects you at the manor, tomorrow, at 10. Elara folded the note. "Thank you. I will be there." She did not seem intimidated or impressed. She simply accepted it, as one accepts the coming of rain. The footman retreated, baffled, and Elara went back to her task of weeding the small patch of earth beside her cottage, her movements economical and serene. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing. Blackwood Manor. The place was a local legend, a palace of sorrow ruled by a ghost of a duke, and his sons. The stories of their wildness were village lore, told with a mixture of awe and pity. She had lost a child of her own, a babe who had not drawn breath past his first winter. The grief was a hollowed-out space inside her, a room she kept locked but never forgot. She saw the same hollow space in the eyes of other children who had lost. She suspected the Duke's sons were not demons. They were just lost boys, rattling the bars of their own gilded, lonely cage, and no one was listening to the sound. The next morning, Elara presented herself at the main entrance of Blackwood Manor. The house loomed, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture that seemed to scowl down at the world. It was designed to inspire awe and announce power. To Elara, it simply felt cold. The air inside was still and heavy, smelling of beeswax and something metallic and sad, like old tears. She was led, not to the Duke, but to a woman who introduced herself as Lady Beatrice Finch, the late Duchess's sister. Lady Beatrice was all sharp angles and silk, her smile a thin, brittle thing. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension so refined it was almost polite. "His Grace is dreadfully occupied. I handle the domestic arrangements, and the children." A proprietary air hung about her. She was the mistress of this domain, in fact, if not in title. "The boys, Julian and Thomas, are spirited," Lady Beatrice continued, her eyes sweeping over Ilara's simple grey dress with faint disdain. "They require a firm hand. The last tutor was far too sentimental. We cannot have that. Sentimentality makes them weak." Ilara's gaze was steady. "Children are not made weak by kindness, Lady Beatrice." A flicker of irritation crossed the woman's face, quickly suppressed. "Your duties will be confined to the schoolroom. You will have your meals there. You will not disturb the running of the household. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Ilara said. The schoolroom was on the third floor, a large, bright room that should have been cheerful. Instead, it was a war zone. Books were torn, an easel was overturned, and a large, ugly ink stain spread across a priceless Aubusson rug like a black wound. Two boys stood in the center of the room, their arms crossed, their faces set in identical masks of defiant hostility. The elder, Julian, had his father's dark hair and a thunderous brow. The younger, Thomas, was smaller, paler, with wide, watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "This is Mrs. Vance," Lady Beatrice announced. "She will be your new governess." She turned to Ilara. "I shall leave you to it." The door clicked shut, a sound of finality, of abandonment. Ilara stood for a long moment simply observing. She did not try to tidy the mess. She did not issue a greeting. She looked at the ink stain, then at the boys. Julian scowled more deeply. Thomas gnawed on his lower lip. Finally, she walked to the window, which overlooked a walled garden, overgrown and neglected. "That was my favorite rose," she said, her voice soft, conversational. She pointed to a tangled, thorny bush. "A climbing blush noisette. My husband planted one for me. It died." The boys exchanged a confused glance. This was not in the script. Tutors were supposed to yell, or lecture, or sigh in despair. They were not supposed to talk about dead roses. "Who are you?" Julian demanded, his voice rough. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, turning from the window. Her eyes, a clear, calm gray, met his. "I am here to be your governess." "We don't want a governess," he spat. "We want you to leave, like all the others." "I see," she said. She walked over to the overturned easel and, with a smooth, strong motion, set it upright. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the floor. "Why did the last one leave?" Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice a near whisper. "We put a frog in his tea." "A frog," Ilara repeated, her expression unreadable. She considered this. "Was it a large frog?" Thomas blinked. "Tolerably." "Did he scream?" "Yes," Julian said, a ghost of a triumphant smirk on his face. "Like a girl." "I imagine he did," Ilara said. She drew a few lines on the easel's paper. It was a surprisingly accurate sketch of a frog. "It must be very lonely," she murmured, almost to herself. "We are not lonely," Julian snapped. Ilara looked at him, her gaze so direct it was unnerving. "Aren't you?" She did not wait for an answer. She went to the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines. Many were pristine, expensive, and clearly unread. Others were ripped and defaced. She ignored both, instead pulling out a simple, well-worn volume. "Have you ever heard the story of the Willow Maid?" They stared at her, silent and suspicious. She did not command them to sit. She simply settled into a chair near the window, the light catching the stray wisps of hair around her face, and opened the book, and she began to read. Her voice was low and melodic, a quiet river flowing through the wreckage of the room. She did not look up to see if they were listening. She just read. After 5 minutes, Thomas, drawn by a force he did not understand, crept closer. After 10, Julian, with a great theatrical sigh of boredom, slumped into a chair just to prove he was not interested. But he was. They both were. The story was about a creature of the woods, lonely and misunderstood. For the first time in 2 years, the schoolroom at Blackwood Manor was silent, save for the sound of a single, steady voice. Ilara Vance had not raised her voice. She had not issued a command. She had simply opened a door into another world and waited to see who would follow her through. The first week passed in a state of armed truce. Elara did not try to enforce a rigid schedule of Latin and arithmetic. Instead, she brought the outside world into the suffocating schoolroom. She arrived one morning with a basket of damp clay from the riverbank. She showed the boys how to roll it, shape it, how to form crude pots and lopsided animals. Their hands, so adept at destruction, were clumsy at first, but soon they were engrossed. The clay was messy. It got on their clothes and under their fingernails. It was real. Julian, ever the cynic, sculpted a monstrous gargoyle. Thomas, quiet and watchful, fashioned a small, delicate bird. He held it up to her. "It's for Mama," he whispered, his voice catching, "so she won't be lonely." It was the first time either of them had mentioned their mother in her presence. Elara's heart gave a painful lurch. She looked at the small, fragile clay bird and saw the shape of a child's bottomless grief. "It is beautiful, Thomas," she said softly. "I am sure she would love it." Lady Beatrice appeared at the door, her face a mask of disapproval. "What is the meaning of this filth?" she demanded, gesturing at the clay-smeared table. "This is a schoolroom, Mrs. Vance, not a potter's hovel." "We are learning about geology," Elara replied calmly, not rising, "about the composition of the earth on the estate." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She was not a stupid woman. She knew she was being challenged, but the nature of the challenge was so subtle, so polite, she could not find purchase for her anger. "See that it is cleaned up. His Grace would be most displeased to see his sons looking like common laborers." She swept out, leaving a trail of lavender water and silent fury. Julian watched her go, his small face tight with an old, familiar anger. "She hates it when we get dirty, does she?" Elara murmured. She began to see the shape of things. Beatrice's control was absolute, built on a foundation of propriety and the suppression of anything messy, loud, or emotional. Anything, in short, that was a natural part of boyhood. The boys were not just grieving their mother, they were suffocating under their aunt's sterile reign. Their wildness was a desperate gasp for air. Alistair, meanwhile, kept his distance. He received daily reports from Beatrice, who painted Elara as an eccentric and ineffective governess who let the boys run riot. "She has them playing in the mud, Alistair. In the mud. What will people say? Are they breaking things?" Alistair asked, his eyes on a ledger. "Well, no, but have they set anything on fire this week?" "No, of course not. But their education." "Then let her play in the mud," he said, cutting her off. He was too tired to argue. He only knew that for the first time in months he had not been summoned to deal with a crisis. The silence from the third floor was, for now, a blessing he was unwilling to question. His curiosity, however, was a slow-growing seed. One afternoon, drawn by an uncharacteristic peal of laughter from the gardens, he looked out his library window. Below, in the neglected walled garden she had pointed out on her first day, was Elara. She was on her knees in the dirt, a trowel in her hand, showing the boys how to clear the weeds from the base of the old rose bush. Thomas was diligently watering a patch of soil, while Julian, his usual scowl replaced by a look of intense concentration, was carefully tying a stray cane to the wall. They were not playing, they were working. And for the first time since their mother's death, they looked content. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling so foreign he could not immediately name it. It was a mixture of relief, shame, and a profound, aching curiosity. Who was this woman, this quiet widow, who had accomplished in 2 weeks what a string of expensive tutors could not? He began to watch, not openly, but from the shadows of his own house. He would stand in the gallery overlooking the great hall when she brought the boys down to look at the portraits of their ancestors, telling them stories not of titles and battles, but of the people themselves. He listened from the doorway of the music room as she sat at the dusty pianoforte, her fingers stiff at first, and played a simple country lullaby. He saw Thomas lean his head against her arm, his eyes closing, and felt that pang again, sharper this time. It was the sting of abdication. He was their father, yet he was a stranger to their comfort. He was the Duke, the master of all this, and he was utterly irrelevant in the small, warm world she was building within his cold, empty walls. The investigation began without his conscious decision. It started with a question that lodged itself in his mind and would not go away. Why had all the others failed so completely? He had accepted Beatrice's explanations at the time. They were weak, unsuitable, ill-equipped. But now, seeing Elara's quiet success, he began to wonder. He sent for the employment files from Hobbs. He spent an entire night in his library, the fire finally lit and crackling, reading through the letters of dismissal and the tutor's final reports. A pattern emerged, chilling in its clarity. Each tutor had started with enthusiasm. Each had reported minor infractions at first, then escalating acts of rebellion. But the letters of dismissal, written by his own secretary on his behalf, were uniformly cold, brutal, and final. They offered no room for discussion. They accused the men of incompetence and, in 2 cases, of cruelty. He remembered signing them, his mind on other matters, trusting the judgment of his staff, of Beatrice. Now, reading them again, he saw them for what they were, weapons. They were designed not just to dismiss, but to destroy a man's reputation. Then he found it. A letter from Mr. Abernathy, the tutor who had found a snake in his bed. It was not his final report. It was a desperate scribbled plea sent directly to the Duke, and Alistair now realized intercepted before it ever reached him. Your Grace, it read, I implore you to listen. The boys are not malicious. They are deeply unhappy. Lady Beatrice countermands my every instruction. She tells them my methods are foolish, that their mother would be ashamed of their lack of progress. She is, if you will forgive my bluntness, poisoning them against any authority but her own. I believe she wishes them to fail. I do not understand why, but I beg you look closer at what is happening in your own home. The letter shook in Alistair's hand. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, poisoning them. He thought of Beatrice's constant, cloying presence, her sweet voice dripping venom about the weakness of sentiment, her careful management of his entire life since Annalise's death. He had seen it as devotion, a sister's grief expressed through service. He had been grateful for it. He had leaned on her, letting her become the barrier between him and the painful, messy reality of his children's lives. What if it was not devotion? What if it was ambition? He stood up, the letter crushed in his fist. He strode through the silent, sleeping house, his purpose a cold, hard flame in his gut. He went to the schoolroom. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was tidy. The clay was gone, replaced by books laid open on the table. A soft glow came from a single lamp. Ilara was sitting in her chair by the window, mending a tear in one of Thomas's shirts. Her head was bent to her task, her expression peaceful. She looked up as his shadow fell across her. Your Grace, she said, her voice calm, unsurprised. He did not speak. He walked to the bookshelf, and his eyes landed on a small, leather-bound volume tucked away on a lower shelf. It was not a school book. It was a diary. A book of pressed flowers. He knew it instantly. It was Annalise's. He had given it to her on their first anniversary. She had filled it with flowers from the gardens, each one labeled in her delicate sloping hand. He had not seen it since she died. He had assumed it was lost or packed away. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. He opened it. There, on the first page, was a pressed blush noisette rose. Beneath it, Annalise had written, For Alistair, who brought me home. He looked at Ilara, a storm of questions in his eyes. I found it in a locked trunk in the attic, she said softly, answering the unspoken question. Lady Beatrice told the staff to clear out all of the late Duchess's personal effects. I thought the boys might like to see it. And did they? He asked, his voice hoarse. They wept, she said simply. Thomas told me his aunt said it was morbid to keep such things, that they must look forward, not back. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such calculated cruelty that it stole his breath. Beatrice had not been helping them move on. She had been trying to erase his wife, to erase the boy's mother, to sever their every connection to the past, leaving them adrift and dependent only on her. And he, in his blind, selfish grief, had let her. He had been the Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense power and influence, and he had allowed a viper to curl up at the heart of his family. She told them their mother would be ashamed of them, he said, the words tasting like ash. It was a statement, not a question. Ilara met his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no, I told you so. There was only a deep, quiet compassion that was, in that moment, more devastating than any accusation. They are not wild, Your Grace, she said. They are just children who miss their mother and their father. The last 3 words struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back, leaning against the bookshelf for support. He looked from Annalise's book to the calm, steady woman in the chair, to the small mended shirt in her hands. He saw the patient work, the quiet listening, the gentle strength that had pierced the heart of his son's sorrow. She had done what he should have been doing all along. She had been a parent. He felt a rage so pure and white-hot it threatened to consume him. It was not directed at Beatrice, not yet. It was directed entirely at himself. The atoning Duke. The title, once a mark of power, now felt like a brand of shame. He had a great deal to atone for, and it would not begin with shouting or accusations. It would begin with humility. "Teach me," he said, the words torn from him. "Teach me how to be their father." Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw past the title, the wealth, the formidable presence. She saw a man shattered by his own failings, finally awake to the devastation around him. And in his eyes, she saw the first fragile flicker of hope. "You do not need to be taught," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You only need to be present." The next morning, Alistair did not go to his study. He did not call for his horse or his secretary. He walked up the 3 flights of stairs to the schoolroom and knocked on the door. Ilara opened it. Behind her, Julian and Thomas were at the table, heads bent over a large map of the world. They looked up, their eyes wide with surprise. Their father never came to the schoolroom. "Good morning," Alistair said. His voice was stiff, unnatural. He felt like an actor in a play for which he had forgotten all his lines. "Mrs. Vance, Julian, Thomas." He walked into the room and stood awkwardly by the wall. Ilara gave a small, encouraging nod. "His Grace is joining us for our lesson on geography today, boys." Julian eyed his father with suspicion. "Why?" It was a simple question, but it cut Alistair to the quick. "Because I have been a fool, because I have failed you, because I am trying to find my way back." He could not say any of that. "Because I was interested," he said, the words inadequate. Ilara, sensing his struggle, smoothly intervened. "Thomas was just showing me the route that Magellan took," she said, pointing to a line drawn in charcoal across the Pacific Ocean. "Perhaps you could tell us about the ports, Your Grace. You have traveled far more than I." It was an offering, a bridge. Gratefully he took it. He walked to the table, bent over the map, and began to speak of harbors he had seen, of the smell of spices in the air in the east, of the towering icebergs in the north. At first his voice was hesitant, but as he spoke, the memories came alive. The boys listened, captivated. He was not the Duke. He was not the remote, angry figure from downstairs. He was a man who had seen the world. He stayed for an hour. When he left, the silence that followed was different. It was not the sullen, angry silence of before. It was thoughtful. He did the same thing the next day, and the next. He learned to sit quietly and listen. He learned that Julian had a sharp, logical mind, and that Thomas was a dreamer who saw stories in the shapes of clouds. He learned that their favorite meal was the simple shepherd's pie the cook made, not the fussy French cuisine Beatrice insisted upon. These were small, simple facts, but to Alistair they were revelations. They were the building blocks of a home he had forgotten how to inhabit. His confrontation with Beatrice was quiet, cold, and final. He summoned her not to the library, his seat of power, but to the small, sunny morning room that had been Annalise's favorite. He had the book of pressed flowers lying open on the table. She entered, smiling, expecting a discussion about menus or guest lists. When she saw the book, her smile froze. "Alistair," she began, her voice tight. "I was just about to—" "I know what you have been doing," he said, his voice devoid of heat. It was colder and far more dangerous for its lack of emotion. "I have read Mr. Abernathy's letter. I have spoken to the staff, the ones you haven't already terrified into silence." She paled. That man was a liar. He was incompetent. Was he? Alistair stood up. Or was he simply a man who saw what I was too blind and grief-stricken to see? "You have spent 2 years systematically trying to erase my wife from this house. You have stifled my sons, told them their grief was a weakness, and driven away anyone who might have offered them a moment of kindness. You did it so they would have no one but you, so that I would have no one but you." Her composure finally cracked. "I did it for you," she hissed, her face contorting. She was weak, Annalise, sentimental and weak. She was not worthy of you. This house needed a strong hand. I gave it one. I gave you order. I gave you peace. You gave me a prison," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You took my son's sorrow and tried to twist it into a weapon for your own ambition. You will pack your things. A carriage will be ready in an hour. You will go to our cousin's estate in Northumberland. You will not write. You will not return. Your allowance will continue, but your presence in my life and in the lives of my children is over." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She had gambled everything, and she had lost. There was no appeal. The quiet finality in his voice was more absolute than any ducal decree. She turned without another word and swept from the room, a queen deposed. The house felt lighter after she was gone. The air itself seemed to thin, to clear. The staff moved with less fear. The cook began making shepherd's pie twice a week. But Alistair knew that casting out the villain was not the end of the story. It was merely the clearing of the stage. The real work, the work of atonement, had just begun. He found Alara in the overgrown garden, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The boys were nearby, attempting to build a small stone wall. "She is gone," he said. Ilara looked up, her grey eyes searching his face. She nodded slowly. "The boys will be relieved." She did not say, "And you?" "I came to ask you to stay," he said, the words feeling clumsy. "Not just as a governess. Your salary will be doubled. You will have your own suite of rooms, anything you require." He was falling back on what he knew, money and power, the tools of a duke. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your Grace, I am not for sale." The gentle rebuke stung more than Beatrice's rage. "That is not what I meant." "What did you mean, Alistair?" she asked, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was both intimate and challenging. He was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the garden filling the space between them. The buzz of a bee, the chink of a stone, his son's low murmuring voices. "I mean," he said finally, his voice raw with a humility he had never known, "that I am lost. And you, Mrs. Vance, you seem to know the way. I am asking you to stay and help me find it, to help me be a father, to help me make this place a home again." He looked at his hands, the hands of a duke, soft and uncalloused. "I do not know how." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. Ilara saw the truth of it in his eyes. This was not a transaction, it was a plea. "The boys still need their lessons," she said, her voice softening. "And this garden will not reclaim itself." It was not a yes to his unasked, undefined question. But it was not a no. It was an agreement to continue. For now, it was enough. Summer bled into the gold and crimson of autumn. The transformation of Blackwood Manor was slow, quiet, and profound. It was not a matter of redecoration, but of rediscovery. Alistair learned to carve wood. Ilara had shown him how, starting him on a simple block of pine. His first attempts were clumsy, but he persisted. He sat with his sons in the evenings, the three of them working in companionable silence, the floor around them littered with fragrant shavings. He carved a clumsy-looking horse for Julian and a slightly lopsided boat for Thomas. They were treasured more than any expensive toy ever had been. One afternoon, Ilara found him by the paddock, his ducal signet ring lying on a fence post, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He was trying to mend a broken rail, his movements awkward but determined. "The stablemaster could do that in half the time," she observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. "The stablemaster did not break it," Alistair said without looking up, wrestling with a nail. "Julian was trying to teach me how to vault the fence. It seems I am less nimble than I was at 20. He finally hammered the nail home, wincing as he struck his thumb. He swore under his breath, then looked at his hand, a faint blush rising on his neck. "My apologies." Ilara handed him a handkerchief from her pocket. "There is no need to apologize for being human, Your Grace." He wrapped the cloth around his throbbing thumb. "Alistair," he corrected her gently. "My name is Alistair." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. The afternoon sun lit her hair, turning the simple brown to threads of amber and gold. Her face was calm, her eyes held a depth he was only just beginning to understand. He had spent his life surrounded by the most beautiful, titled women in England, but none of them had ever looked as lovely as this quiet village widow in her simple dress, standing in a muddy paddock with a smudge of dirt on her cheek. A feeling rose in him, warm and powerful. It was more than gratitude, more than respect. It was a feeling he thought had died with Annalise. "Ilara," he said, testing her name on his tongue. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her how she had brought light back into his life, how she had given him back his sons, but the words caught in his throat. It was too soon. The penance was not yet complete. He had to earn the right to speak such words. So instead, he picked up his ring from the fence post, its heavy gold cool against his skin. He did not put it back on. He slipped it into his pocket. It felt like laying down a burden he had carried for too long. The moment of true change came on a rainy November evening. A fire roared in the library, the first truly cheerful blaze the room had seen in years. Alistair was reading to the boys, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. Julian and Thomas were curled on a rug at his feet, their heads resting against his knees. Ilara was there too, sitting in a nearby armchair, ostensibly reading her own book, but mostly just watching them, a soft smile on her lips. Alistair finished the chapter and closed the book. Thomas was already asleep, his small face peaceful. Julian was drowsy, his eyes heavy. "Time for bed, I think," Alistair said softly. He looked at Julian. "Can you manage him?" Julian nodded. Together, they helped the sleepy Thomas to his feet. As they turned to go, Julian stopped and looked back at his father. "Father," he said, his voice serious, "I am glad you sent Aunt Beatrice away. She smelled of lies." The childlike bluntness of the statement struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He could only nod, his throat tight. He watched his sons leave the room, one leaning on the other, and a wave of profound love and gut-wrenching guilt washed over him. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. All this time he had been blind. He felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. He looked up into Ilara's compassionate eyes. "You cannot change the past, Alistair," she said softly. "But I was there," he choked out, the words thick with self-loathing. "I was in the same house. I saw them every day. How could I not have seen? How could I let her do that to them? To Annalise's memory?" His grief, so long suppressed, finally broke free. It was not the silent, noble grief of a duke. It was the raw, ugly sorrow of a man who had failed everyone he loved. He wept not for his loss, but for his own culpability. Ilara did not offer platitudes. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She simply knelt before him, took his hand, and held it. Her touch was firm, steady, an anchor in his storm of regret. She waited until the worst of it had passed, until his ragged breaths began to even out. "You see it now," she said, her voice a quiet anchor in the dim room. "That is what matters. You are here now. You are listening. You have come home." He looked at their joined hands, his, large and pale, marked by his clumsy carpentry. Hers, smaller, stronger, stained by the earth of her garden. They were from different worlds, a duke and a widow. But in that moment, in the warm, fire-lit library, they were just a man and a woman who understood the geography of loss, who were charting a new map together. "Stay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Ilara, please, stay with me, with us, not as a governess, as my wife." The proposal hung in the air between them, as real and fragile as a soap bubble. It was not a duke's command, it was a broken man's plea. Ilara searched his face. She saw the truth of his change. She saw the humility, the hard-won awareness, the deep, abiding love he felt for his sons. She saw a future she had never dared to imagine for herself, a future filled with laughter and mud and warmth and love. She had come to Blackwood Manor to heal two lost boys. She had not expected to heal their father, or herself in the process. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, Alistair, I will." Forgiveness was not a single act, but a daily choice, and love, she was discovering, was not about grand gestures or gilded cages. It was about mending fences and reading stories by the fire and holding a hand in the dark. It was about being present. The wedding was a small, private affair. The only guests were Mr. Hobbs, beaming with pride, and a few trusted servants. Julian and Thomas stood as their father's groomsmen, wearing slightly too large suits, their faces shining with a happiness so pure it brought tears to Alistair's eyes. Blackwood Manor was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home. The sound of children's laughter echoed in the great hall. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale smell of sorrow. The overgrown walled garden bloomed again under Ilara's patient care. The blush noisette rose climbing triumphantly up the ancient stone, its pale pink flowers a promise of renewal. One bright spring afternoon, a year after Ilara had first arrived, the four of them were down by the lake. Alistair was teaching Julian how to skip stones. Thomas was chasing butterflies. Ilara, the new Duchess of Blackwood, sat on a blanket, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching her family. Her husband, no longer a remote, haunted figure, but a man present in his own life, his face relaxed and smiling. Her sons, no longer wild and grieving, but happy, thriving boys. Alistair came and sat beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders. He followed her gaze to the boys. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said quietly. "This peace." "It was always here," Ilara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Just waiting to be found." He looked at her, his heart full. She had not raised her voice. She had not commanded or demanded. She had simply entered his broken world, and with quiet strength and infinite patience had shown him how to put the pieces back together. She had saved them all. Thomas ran up to them, his face flushed, his hands cupped together. "Look!" he cried, his voice full of wonder. He opened his hands. Inside was a small painted lady butterfly. It rested on his palm for a heartbeat, its wings trembling before it fluttered up and away, a tiny vibrant speck of life against the vast blue sky. They watched it go, the four of them together, silent and content, bathed in the warm light of the afternoon sun. The silence was no longer an absence, it was a presence. It was the sound of a family whole once more. It was the sound of home.